Thank you, Reed, and thank you, Skip. What an honor to be here. I have never been to Little Rock, and I wish I had more time this morning, but it didn't take me long to walk along the river. I stopped in at Gus's Chicken. I went up and down the street, and I said, I get it. I don't quite get the hogs, but I'm trying. No, I really, it's truly an honor to be here. I was a journalist covering so many turning points in the world at the time when President Clinton was the President of the United States. And I was thinking about the times I saw him at so many intersections of history. I saw him in Kosovo. I was there on the ground in Pristina, and I heard him give an amazing speech right there to these people, these refugees who had fled their homes and who saw the United States come in and fight against the tyranny of the Serbian government that had forced them out in ethnic cleansing. I was in Gaza, dusty, hot Gaza, when President Clinton became the first president ever to travel to the Palestinian-controlled areas and give a speech. And the speech was amazing. It was beautiful. I really was inspired by it because he spoke about the things we hold to be true as a country, about democracy. And he talked about how if the Palestinian state is going to become a state, and it's going to survive, and it's going to thrive, it's going to have to work hard to be a democracy. But he also embraced, in his own way, he really embraced the suffering of the Palestinian people, which you don't hear a lot about in the United States. I think you hear about it sometimes, but I don't know. I don't know that people really get that life under occupation is really difficult. I think too often we in the media, I put myself in this mix, we cover the violence, we sort of cover the conflict, but do we really capture the lives? You know, do we capture what it's like to be Israeli and wake up and just as a human being be worried about your kids with the bus bombings, just the simple stories of life? And do we capture on the other side Palestinians and their families and how they have to live and the checkpoints they go through and the persecution they've suffered under occupation? President Clinton's great gift was to tell those stories, both sides, fairly, try to pull them together. I was proud as an American to see the President of the United States doing that. Proud when the peace agreements were signed. Proud when there was some progress in the peace process. And just really proud, I guess, to know that those ideals that we all hold to be true were so beautifully upheld through his words, his eloquence, and his great work ethic, and just his ability to connect. So I say that here because I think we're in a really challenging moment right now. I think we're also in a really exciting moment. The digital revolution that Reed really beautifully explained to you is a time of tremendous opportunity, a time of great uncertainty in the newspaper business and in the news business in general, but a time of excitement and hope, I think, too. So I wanted to talk about the digital revolution. How many of you here are connected to journalism or are thinking about going into journalism? Just a little bit curious to know. Okay, great, great. This is the most exciting time in many generations to be going into journalism. This is a time when so many will talk about the collapse and the decay of newspapers, and there'll be editors like myself with a touch of gray who are going to start talking about the good old days, and there were some really fun good old days, I'll tell you. But the days ahead are so exciting. The ideas that you can bring forward now, the innovation you can do online, the way you can tell stories, the power, the reach is extraordinary. So I want to really encourage those of you who are thinking about to do it. The digital revolution, as it's called, is something that GlobalPost feels a part of in a small way, but I think Egypt and its revolution is a really big part of the digital revolution. How many of you watched in early 2011 as those events unfolded on the streets in Cairo? Okay. They called it the Facebook Revolution. And it was young people who gathered on Facebook and who called people out to the street via Facebook, via social networking. And they got around the police state of Hosni Mubarak, which for 30 years, that government under Hosni Mubarak had controlled Egypt with great brutality and great corruption and great support by the United States of America. $1.3 billion a year going to the Egyptian military. But those people on Facebook, many of them, and many of them who I've talked to, talk about a speech that President Obama gave in June of 2009 at the University of Cairo, where he talked about how the United States reaches out with open hands to the Muslim world, and that the United States believes that democracy is a universal right. And I honestly think that the Arab Spring triggering mechanism, now not the movement, it would be an exaggeration to say that speech caused the Arab Spring. That would rob the Arab people of the courage they showed in going to the street to claim their own rights. But I do think it was a spark. I do think it was meaningful and not often remembered. And I think sometimes the White House sort of doesn't want to take responsibility for the Arab Spring because it hasn't turned out so good. But the seeds of the idea of democracy as a universal right that were born of that speech and that people clung to and that people put forward is something to be proud of. So on Egypt, I'm telling you, these old, cagey veteran journalists like myself, I've covered everything. I've covered the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, I covered Kosovo, I covered Bosnia, I covered Palestinian-Israeli conflict and peace process, and then the return to conflict. I covered Belfast, I covered Medellin, Colombia, I covered El Salvador, I covered Nicaragua. I think about the conflict I've covered, and I think, here was a story February of 2011 that I was allowing myself to get swept into the tremendous hope you could feel on the streets of Cairo as these young people went to the streets by the millions, relatively and largely peaceful demonstrations. There were counter demonstrations that were violent, but the people who were calling for the toppling of Mubarak were, from my eyes on the street, not violent. They were peaceful. But it wasn't just the Facebook generation that made that happen. The Facebook generation, I don't think was going to get it done on its own. And the Facebook generation eventually took some of their younger members who were also part of the Muslim Brotherhood and sent them out and said, you know, where's the Muslim Brotherhood? Because the Muslim Brotherhood is a very strong underground movement in Egypt for a long time. And I want to get into their history a little bit because it's a really checkered past, a complex moment, and a troubling future. It's hard to explain. I'm going to come back to them. But in Tahrir Square, in that moment, the Muslim Brotherhood came out. When the Muslim Brotherhood took to the streets, it was a game changer. Because revolution and change is about more than social networking and checking your Twitter feed. It's about the hard work of going to the street and fighting for something you believe in. And the Muslim Brotherhood played a huge role in coming forward and putting a lot of people in the street, whether you like it or not, and whether you like them or you don't. It's an inevitable, an unavoidable fact of history. In that moment in 2011, I couldn't believe it when Mubarak stepped down. Do you all remember that? I mean, did it mean much? It was hard for me to know because I've covered the Middle East for so long. I've been away. I had 4 children born. My wife and I lived all over the world. We've been covering all these things. I'm way too caught up in international affairs. I have no sense of what people care about. Did you really, I don't know how to do this, but like by a show of hands, do you really remember when he stepped down? Were you like watching CNN? Okay. See, I thought everyone would raise their hand. I'm like completely, I'm delusional on how much people care about this stuff. But what a moment. What an amazing moment in history. So I allowed myself to feel hopeful. If you watch the documentary we did with Frontline, which aired on Tuesday night, the opening scene is sort of me sitting there looking like this dopey optimist, like, wow, this is so awesome. And thinking, here's a moment where democracy's really speaking. I kept going back to Egypt, and I had to do this while running the editorial operation at GlobalPost, so it's not that easy because there's a lot to balance. At GlobalPost, we wanted to be there in Egypt because we are a digital news organization and we wanted to cover the first digital revolution. So I'm going to quickly tell you GlobalPost. Reed introduced it beautifully, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. Reed, I don't think you told the story of how you traded your TV for a barbecue sandwich, though, which is that's true, right? My research is accurate, isn't it? Okay. Media shifting. No one Reed's age, I'll argue, was watching CNN when Mubarak stepped down. They were following it on a Twitter feed. Do you remember following it at all? How were you getting your news then? Democracy Now? Someone about Reed's age once said to me, if the news is important enough, it will find me. I don't have to go look for news, it will find me. Now, I think that's amazing and horrifying, because you're not an active participant in that. And I'm going to encourage young people here to think about that. You got to claim your news. You got to own it. You got to know who's telling it to you. You got to know what their funding bases are. You should be asking me who our funding bases are. I'm happy to discuss it with you. I think we need to have transparency. We've got to have great media. I'm really old school. I'm like annoyingly old school. Like Democracy Now, I don't know. I don't hear the other side often enough. Fox News, definitely don't hear the other side there. MSNBC, okay, better, and yes, GlobalPost has a partnership with NBC, so we love MSNBC. But I think that, I think even on NBC, great journalists sometimes find themselves saying, well, I don't have an opinion on this. I'm trying to be a reporter, stick to the facts, and help you understand the story. At GlobalPost, we like to say, we don't want to tell you what to think, but at GlobalPost, we want to tell you what to think about. So we have 70 correspondents now in 50 countries. We started 5 years ago. We have key partnerships. I told you with NBC and with these newspapers. 75 newspapers for syndication, NPR.org. But we're a tiny news organization. We're trying to figure out how we're going to fund the kind of journalism we want to tell. And it's expensive. So we're a mix. We're trying to be self-sustaining through online advertising, syndicating our stories, and we also receive foundation grants from the Ford Foundation, from the Luce Foundation, and from other foundations. We're a mix. We're like a hybrid. We're not NPR or commercial. We're trying to be both, and we're trying to be focused on doing great news. And with our limited funds, there was one story that I knew as a co-founder I wasn't going to miss, and that was Egypt. So I went myself on the streets in partnership with Frontline, PBS Frontline, and we worked together on this documentary. The first one aired in February of 2011, just after Mubarak stepped down. The second one aired Tuesday night. But from February 2011 to today, we went back 5, 6, 7 times to Egypt to follow each turning point of that story. We reported those live on GlobalPost, but we were building footage to share in this documentary that aired Tuesday night, and I'd love you to see it. It's called Egypt in Crisis. And I found myself struggling to work with a really great team. Frontline, in my mind, is like the best. They are really thorough in the long form of documentary storytelling. But it's hard to do that when you're trying to cover a speeding train. How do you capture it? How do you get the moment? And I think we ended knowing that we weren't done here. We're going to have to come back. So watch it and look at that. But quickly to go through the history. 2011, Mubarak, after 30 years, US-backed dictator, is forced to step down. You go into a situation of slight turmoil. The military, which basically backed the stepping down of Mubarak, or allowed it to happen, then starts to crack down on the demonstrators, clears them from the square, with a little red flag going up, like, wait a second, so who's in charge, the military or pro-democracy, or is the military is a very trusted institution in Egypt? It's also an institution that controls 40% of the private sector economy. It has 350,000 soldiers. And in Egypt, it's called the deep state. And the question is now, wasn't the deep state always in charge? Under Mubarak, when Mubarak fell, when they cracked down on the demonstrators, when they held the elections? It's a question on the table. It's one that history is going to judge, but we're going to keep asking really hard. In those first elections in Egypt following the collapse of Mubarak, they were the first free and fair elections in 5,000 years of Egypt's history. And 40% of the parliamentary seats went to the Muslim Brotherhood. If you include the other Islamist parties, more than 2/3 of parliament was controlled by Islamists. And in the United States, I noticed the joy and hope wash out of everyone's face when I started talking about Egypt. And everyone looked a little pale, like, what is going to happen in Egypt with Islamists? Especially if you watched Fox News. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about the history of the Muslim Brotherhood and those Islamist parties. The Muslim Brotherhood is an 80-year-old organization in Egypt. It started off with a really horrific and dark connection to Nazism. It is not pretty in its origins. It is born of the frustrations of Hassan al-Banna, the founder of the idea of Islam needing to inform government more than sort of secular notions of democracy, because they weren't seeing that really happen in the post-colonial era. His feeling was we need to have a sort of Islamic society, and that is the way forward. So the slogan of the Muslim Brotherhood for all these decades has been, Islam is the solution. So their past is checkered. Some violence, some not. But irrevocably true is that they grew underground. They tried to assassinate an Egyptian president, and after that, there was a huge crackdown on them, and they were pushed underground, and they were outlawed as a party, as a movement, as an organization. But they continued to try to provide services where the government, which is corrupt and failing to provide many services, they provided kindergartens, they provided health care. They began to do the work in the poor neighborhoods that were neglected, that gained them a loyalty and a following. So like them or not, they were getting a following. Go through the decades, that grows and grows and grows, but all underground. So there's this underbrush growing of the Muslim Brotherhood, thwarted by Mubarak, until the United States says, hey, you got to lighten up. You got to have like something that at least looks like a fair election once in a while. And as soon as Mubarak lets his foot off the brake a little bit and allows some elections, Muslim Brotherhood is still outlawed, but they're allowed to put forward candidates. As long as they don't call them Muslim Brotherhood, they win 20% of parliament. So Mubarak says, well, that was 2010. And then Mubarak says, that's never going to happen again. These guys aren't going to ever get that again. So the history of revolutions are, the greatest catalyst to change is something called rising expectations. In the French Revolution and in the American Revolution, there are many historians who would say it's the rising expectation, the sense that those who want change are on the cusp of change, and then it's stopped. And that's when revolution can happen. So Egypt's revolution is still unfolding. Egypt's revolution is unfinished. But you have to understand the Muslim Brotherhood's role to understand the revolution. So that Muslim Brotherhood begins to coalesce its power. And along the way, it rejects violence. It publicly rejects violence. And it says, we are no longer going to go that way. And this is very important to understand, that many people in the Muslim Brotherhood then left the Muslim Brotherhood. And they formed more militant organizations like Islamic Jihad, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and Gama Islamiyah. One of the people who formed these organizations, Gama Islamiyah, was a guy named Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, who was responsible in 1993 for leading the first World Trade Center bombing, which was my first entry point to covering them. Because I was a street reporter in New York City, heard a loud bang in Lower Manhattan, went to the parking garage, 1993, in the World Trade Center parking garage, smoke's billowing out. No one knows what it is. And in 1993, no one thought that loud bang was terrorism. The police who first arrived at the scene thought, it must be a generator explosion. It's a subway accident. We heard a lot of things going in. But as I got close to the edge of that parking garage and looked in and saw a 6-story deep crater, I had covered Belfast. I had covered Colombia. I had seen bombings, and I knew that's a bombing. So America woke up to terrorism in 1993. I began to cover the stories. I looked at how this was coming together. It was nascent al-Qaeda. We didn't even know it. I sympathized with the FBI and CIA because it was very hard to see. But I had a great editor, a city editor at the Daily News, who encouraged me to go follow the suspects. And it took me to Egypt, where one of the suspects was from, and Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman, who instigated it. And I met with the Muslim Brotherhood. And I even could find and meet with Gama Islamiyah. And I saw then, and it's true now, and it's an important piece of history, the Muslim Brotherhood and these more militant factions, they hate each other. Muslim Brotherhood has rejected violence and embraced democracy. If you believe them. I mean, some people will say, come on, they're violent, they do stuff. I think that they're going to be judged for that, and I don't know all the answers on that. But I do know that they believe in democracy, and they believed in it enough that they got elected to 2/3, well, 40% of the seats in parliament. Al-Qaeda had as its number 2 under bin Laden a guy named Ayman al-Zawahiri. Ayman al-Zawahiri is also Egyptian, but Ayman al-Zawahiri is part of that militant faction that broke away, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and sided with a new organization that pulled together all the militant factions around the region and said, forget democracy, forget trying to change from within, forget everything the West tells you, because if we actually win, they're never going to let us run the country anyway. So, democracy is a Western ploy. Don't buy it. That's Al-Qaeda. That's Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman. That's also Zawahiri. They don't believe in democracy. The Muslim Brotherhood were the underground guys who fought for decades to actually try to believe in democracy. Neither one of these guys, these two big camps, are very pretty. A lot of their history is not, on either side, is anything you'd ever want to look too deeply into, because there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of hatred, and I don't want to ever be somehow thought of as somehow promoting the Muslim Brotherhood. But I do recognize that they embraced the idea of coming into the realm of democracy and fighting for it. So, fast forward now, knowing that history, knowing those decades of the Muslim Brotherhood coming up, imagine how thrilled they were when they won. They won the democratic election. They were in power. Then they blew it. Then they were terrible at governing. Then it turns out that the Muslim Brotherhood, which talked about the long road to an Islamic society, we will never force it, we will never use violence, we will always peacefully try to put forward an Islamic society, they rammed through a constitution that no Egyptian liked. Even traditional Muslim Egyptians who take their faith very seriously, which is a big majority of the country, said this constitution that the Muslim Brotherhood government rammed through doesn't reflect the Egyptian character and its spirit, and they rejected it. They felt like they didn't control the military. They never checked the military. The military's got 40% control of the private sector economy. And the Muslim Brotherhood left them completely alone. Let them have no civilian review of their budget. They just said, okay, so there was a deal, many feel, in the works in which the Muslim Brotherhood got power, Egyptian military left alone. If that's what President Morsi, who came out of the Muslim Brotherhood, the head of the Freedom and Justice Party, the political wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, If that's what he thought, then he miscalculated. Because on June 30th, the people spoke, just as they did on early 2011. June 30th, this summer, how many of you saw the footage of the Egyptian people going to the street, calling for Morsi to resign? Wasn't that amazing? 20 million people on the streets of Egypt. The BBC, a news organization not prone to exaggeration, called it the largest political demonstration in history since the BBC's been in existence. There is no comparable example of people coming out to say they want to reject this government. That's an amazing event that has to be considered carefully. What happens then is the military sees this going down and puts forward an ultimatum and says, President Morsi, here are some dictates. You call early elections and you do the following things, or, I'm sorry, we're going to remove you from the presidency. Now that's when all the demonstrators in the street are kind of like, well, wait a second, that's not what we said. We said we want Morsi gone. We didn't say we want a military dictatorship back. So there's this tension point for a few days. What's going to happen? And on July 3rd, President Morsi was detained and taken to an undisclosed location where he remains. Now, we were declined comment from the White House, declined comment from the State Department. We were asking for this at a time when they were a little bit busy with something called Syria, so I don't want to make too much of the decline to comment. But I do think we need answers. We need to know those answers. We need to hear from the White House. We need to hear from the State Department. Where were you? Did you support the military overthrowing the elected government? Or what was your stance? We don't know that. We need to know that. We got to stay on them to give us answers on that. But whatever happened, I think if you look it up in the dictionary, it's hard not to call it a military coup, because the elected president was out, the government was disbanded, and the military was back in charge. So the White House does not call it a military coup. Does anyone know why? Yes? Exactly. Exactly. Although they would say because it wasn't one. They'd say it was the popular will of the people, the military stepped in. But you're right. There's this other reason, which is if it is called a military coup and declared a coup, then we are, by law, not allowed to continue with the $1.3 billion in funding. So it's not called a coup in the White House. On the streets of Egypt, by those who believed in the democratically elected government of Morsi, it's a coup. Everybody else, the other side of the equation here, is searching for answers for what to call it. I think they're hopeful. The thing I heard on the Egyptian street that's probably the most ringing, truthful term I heard is it's an impeachment from the street. We don't have a constitution with articles of impeachment, and therefore we impeached him from the street. And I think that's a pretty interesting phrase. The point is, why do you need to care? Like, why should an American care about all this tumult in Egypt and all this complicated piece of the equation? And I think you need to care because we need to decide in the United States what we believe in and how we project it to the world through our foreign policy. Do we believe in stability or democracy? Do we believe in stability for our own interests, which is a rational argument? Or do we believe in democracy, which is a beautiful ideal and may challenge many of those notions of stability? We may not get elected the people we like. But what do we believe in? Now, I heard that speech that President Obama gave in June 2009, and I was inspired as an American. But now on the complex streets of Egypt with violence, with an Islamist government that was not good to women, that was not good to the Christian minority, that wasn't feeling representative to the people of Egypt, and to the incredibly complex equation of how do they figure this out? How are they going to balance the yearning of a country that is deeply religious, just like our own, How are they going to balance that faith in forming government and shaping government, I think they would say, and maintaining a democracy? That's something that the Arab world and the Muslim world is trying to figure out. And I would argue they could use a little help. And we happen to know a lot about democracy in this country. We have a lot to add to the conversation. We can't tell them what to do, but we certainly could reach out a little bit more, I would argue, and help. And I would argue, and I find myself slipping into this opinionated realm that I don't like in journalism, but I've covered the Middle East for a long time, and I think my view here is informed by fact. And I think it's informed by history, and I think it's informed by being there on the ground and witnessing it. And that is that I would even say we owe it to Egypt to help them. For 30 years, we funded a police state that thwarted their dreams. If you turn back the clock 30 years ago, South Korea and Egypt had the same economy. Look at South Korea today and look at Egypt today. Both cultures are great, sophisticated, educated people. They both were ruled under a military junta, but one country did well and another didn't. Why is that? I don't know. But did we put forward a policy of stability that stunted their growth, that thwarted their dreams? And if we did, then I'd say we owe it to them to help them figure out how to build a good democracy that can be inclusive and can be representative, not hijacked by Islamists, nor under the tyranny of a military dictatorship. Complicated, hard to get there. I don't have the answers. God bless the peacemakers, the diplomats, and the public servants who will have to figure this out, because it's a tough one. It's really tough. But I think we need to think about it. And everyone asks me, I can't tell you, I've been speaking a lot, and I keep hearing this notion, you know, aren't you a pest? Like, aren't you just so tired of the Middle East? How could you ever be optimistic? You know, you say that you're sort of hopeful here. How is that possible? How could you be hopeful after covering the Middle East for 25 years and seeing all this violence? And that one time I allowed myself to be hopeful, in Tahrir Square, look where it's taken us. Right? I mean, they're being polite and not calling me a sucker, but I guess it's the implication, or naive would be the polite phrase. And maybe I am naive, but I'll tell you, I remain hopeful. And I remain hopeful because I think democracy takes hard work and a long time. And I think that they'll get there. They'll get there faster with our help. But I think we need to care because we can make this thing happen in Egypt. The United States could have a role in Egypt succeeding in its revolution to becoming a more inclusive democratic country, because it's the most populous nation in the Arab world, and because we have a good relationship with them, and because we trust each other on the highest levels, and there's a lot we can do to make it happen. And the reason we ought to do it there is because once that's done, then you got Libya, then you've got Tunisia, then you've got, God willing, when this war stops in Syria, you have Syria. And those, particularly Syria, are much harder equations. Right now, Syria, as you all know, is just this tragic bloodbath. 100,000 killed. We can all feel hopeful for the diplomacy that was done in recent weeks and thwarted the idea of a U.S. military action through negotiations, through diplomacy. Good work, right? But in that same week that Secretary of State Kerry and President Obama and President Putin and the world tried to come together to put that deal together, as tenuous as it is, in that week 1,000 more people died in Syria, adding to the pile of 100,000 who've been killed in that war. So you got to stop the war in Syria, but let's have Egypt sorted as you work toward that. Because then once Syria's got some form of ending this conflict, they have a really complicated road ahead to put together their own democracy. And I hope they can do that. But be hopeful. Be hopeful for this reason. You here in this school are studying under the name of a president who was born in a place called hope, to quote a phrase. And that's what made him a leader, I think. That's what made him great, was that through it all, through all of the people telling him it's not possible, you're naive, you're a sucker, you're too late, conflicts rising, there's no way you're going to have an impact, it's never going to work. He worked at things and he made them work. He made it work in the Good Friday Agreement in Belfast. I know because I was there. The action in Kosovo was extraordinarily successful. I know because I was there. The efforts made in Israel-Palestine were productive, and I was there. And now I'm wondering, where's that hope? Where is that sense of someone who's going to really see this thing clearly? And I'm going to be really candid. I don't see it in the White House right now. I'm not hearing it. I heard a beautiful speech, but where's the commitment to making democracy work? I'm not hearing it. If I had a hope and a wish, it would be this. I'd like to get Egyptians to watch Martin Luther King's speech on this 50th anniversary of his famous words of "I have a dream." And anyone who hears that speech, if your heart doesn't sing every time you hear it and long for something in our country that we know we can be better, then I don't know if you're a human being, because it's so loaded with the emotion of freedom. And I'd love them to hear that speech, but I'd like them even more then to crack a history book and go back. Don't have to study ancient history, which Egyptians are good at. You just have to go back to the Little Rock Nine. And you just have to go back a few years before that to Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. And you have to go, okay, the speech is 63, and then you got to go forward even a month to the Birmingham church bombings. And you got to go forward a little bit more until you get to the Voting Rights Act. And you got to look at the incredible hard work over decades that went into the civil rights movement in this country that made our democracy better. And you got to say, democracy's about hard work. And hey, we can teach you that. We can help you get that because we believe in it. Thank you.
We do have time for some questions, so if you raise your hand, we'll get a microphone to you. Yeah, I'll get you second, right here. Yeah.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having me.
I am from another occupied country in the Middle East. It's not only being occupied by one country, but it's been occupied by 4 different countries. It's Kurdistan. It's been occupied by Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. I have a question, and its situation is a lot worse than Palestinians. No offense to anyone, but and we are the largest nation in the world that is stateless. We are 40 million people, and we don't have an independent country. I wonder why the international media never covers the Kurdish issue, and it makes me question if there is an unknown power that controls the media. Another question is, Kurds are fighting the terrorist organization of Al-Qaeda in Syria right now. And we are not liked by extremists, like Islamic extremists in the Middle East, because we are a lot more modernized than many nations around. And but nobody even knows about this. You know, we are fighting Al-Qaeda because we are protecting our land. Right. They are trying to make my country an Islamic state, and which we're not okay with.
May I ask, which country within Kurdistan are you from?
Unfortunately, I'm from Turkey. I don't like to say that, but I happen to be born Turkey. Okay. Yeah. So, but I'm from Kurdistan, and but again, as I said, it really makes me want to question why the international media never covers the Kurdish issue?
It's a great question, and thank you for it. I've covered Diyarbakir. I've been to Kurdistan. I've reported on the incredible irony of something that I was very critical of the Clinton administration of, which was the massive selling of arms after the end of the Cold War. There was a very hard-hitting series we did at the Boston Globe, where I worked for many years before starting GlobalPost. And that series was titled Armed for Profit. And you ask who's controlling it. I wish the media had this kind of power. We don't, okay? And we do go tell those stories. But I do think there are powers and forces at work that are worth pondering. And I think one of them that's worth pondering is the global arms market, arms dealers. And if you look at Turkey and you look at the idea that after the Cold War ended, we were selling F-16 fighters to Turkey. Then we were selling those same F-16 fighters, well, the military was buying them from McDonnell Douglas to protect the no-fly zone. So you had F-16s that are on one side of Kurdistan and Iraq protecting the Kurds, the no-fly zone, in the aftermath of the first Gulf War. And the other side, we got F-16s, also US-made, bombing the Kurds. We'll sell to whatever they want to do, right? And that sense of losing our moral compass in the arms trade was something that I think that President Clinton, all of the praise I gave is there, but this was one where I'd be very critical of the way in which arms were sold all over the world. And I think that to me was the crystallizing moment of your question of why aren't we covering this? But I want you to read the series. I think you'd see truths in it that maybe you didn't see in a lot of media. We paid attention to the issue. We tried our best. I don't want you to think no one ever did it. I was in Diyarbakir. I was in the villages that had been bombed. I talked to people. I hiked up into the mountains. I saw that it felt a lot like this place probably felt in 1955 if you were African American. If you are Kurdish and you live in Diyarbakir, I saw what it was. Okay, so I had a sense of what it feels like to have to cross a checkpoint as a grown man and be treated by some young soldier that disrespectfully. I've seen that. I've seen just a glimpse of what you've lived. And I'm with you. It's a huge story. It's one we need to stay on. We also, as journalists, had a great experience with the Kurdish people in northern Iraq in this war. Not the first Gulf War, but this war in Iraq, the George Bush war in Iraq, 2003. And again, many of us were there. I was there in Kurdistan with the PUK and with going out into the hills and looking at how the Peshmerga, these guys who, the US military was blown away how great these fighters were. Remember the Peshmerga? They were the Kurdish militias that supported the US government in the war in Iraq. Amazing fighters. As I was with one unit and the guy goes, you know, man, the dudes with the MC Hammer pants. You know those big baggy pants that MC Hammer used to wear? They wear those, what are they called? Yeah, so these guys were amazing and great fighters, and I watched the bond between Americans, seeing this, learning about the Kurdish reality. They never had been really seen this or heard this. So it's there, and I was actually there outside of Halabja, up in the hills, Halabja where Saddam used gas, on the Kurdish people, up in the hills, watching this Kurdish government that had been, from their point of view, very understandable point of view, betrayed by the United States of America when they helped fight in the first Gulf War, and we walked on them. And Saddam moved in and treated them very poorly, many thousands killed. They still, despite that, fought alongside the United States up against Ansar al-Islam in the hills, and I was there and watched the whole thing, and they were courageous, and I saw that Islamist takeover happening within Kurdistan. So I don't want you to think no one covers it, because some have, and we need to do more. But there are so many places like this in the world that GlobalPost is trying to cover. We're trying to say, here are the undercovered parts of the world. Let's go there. And have you been on GlobalPost? Okay. I really want to invite you to come. GlobalPost.com. It's free. And you will see, I hope, that we do pay attention to these issues. There's a great reporter, Nikki Sebecki, photographer and writer, who did a series on Kurdistan. And I'll be glad to send you the link. I'll give you my card and I'll shoot you the link. I'd like your feedback on it. And I'd invite you to really participate in our site and challenge us if we're not covering it, okay?
Here you go.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Dr. Bowman. I teach here at the Clinton School.
Nice to
Your
meet you.
depiction of Egypt rings very true to me since I was also there at the time you were. But there's one thing I wanted you to address for the audience, which is the role of the secularists as well as the secular history of Egypt and how that's part of the story.
That's a great question. May I ask why you were there? Were you there teaching? Were you there as part of an NGO, or what was your role?
I arrived the first day of the revolution to teach at the American University in Cairo.
Seriously,
And I was
that's
also
beautiful.
there when Morsi got elected.
Okay.
And so
Wow. And so did you teach during the revolution and the aftermath, or did you leave?
I stayed through the whole thing.
Wow.
Evacuated my children and came back to work.
Well, I'm honored by that work, because those people and that university in particular plays a hugely important role. I'd love you could even maybe share some of the history of American University. I'm sure you could do it better, but it's a really important part of civil society in Egypt that is connected to America, I would say, trying to share our values in the Arab world. It's also highly criticized by many people as a sort of Western colonial outpost. But I'd say there's some core there of great education and teaching. And I know Nabil Fahmy, who was one of the deans there, and now the foreign minister. Question is secular government. Secular government is something that is a big part of Egypt's history as a pan-Arab nationalist seat of power under Nasser. I think that the idea born out of Egypt was that it will be a sort of Arab nationalist Middle East. That's what they'd hoped for, not one that was Islamist. So the traditions were there with Nasser for a long time, but they quickly dissipated. And I would say there was an amazing piece in the New Yorker magazine in the early 90s or mid 90s maybe by a woman named Marianne Weaver, who writes a lot on Egypt for the New Yorker. Marianne's an amazing journalist, and she wrote very early on, she saw something and she called it Islamic Revolution by Stealth. That Egypt was morphing religious and no one was paying attention. So Mubarak is cracking down, of course, on the Islamists who are fighting against him in Asut and Minya, who come from Egyptian Islamic Jihad and Gama Islamiyah, those breakaways from the Muslim Brotherhood that embraced violence. He crushed them. Hung thousands, tens of thousands put in jail. Brutal crackdown. But at the same time, he crushed the Islamist movement. He recognized that Egypt has a deep yearning for more Islamic influence in their lives. They wanted more elements of Sharia to be codified into their constitution. And he was allowing it to happen with marriage laws and divorce laws, with the way women were treated under the constitution. It was softened. It was made more Islamic, less secular. And that softening, ironically, was done under Mubarak. So that now there's this Islamist overlay, that once you have an Islamist elected, democratically elected government, it wasn't that hard for them to tweak it and make it really Islamist. And then start to really alienate women and really alienate the Christian minority that's there. About 5 to 6% of Egypt is Coptic Christian. A small minority. They've been treated poorly for hundreds of years, but increasingly poorly in recent months and years. So I would say the secular core that makes Egyptian society a wonderfully complex and cultural place has been, it's been diluted over the decades. And even though that is its national identity, and those who live in Zamalek, the rich neighborhood in Cairo, the sort of the posh neighborhood where a lot of the Facebook generation came out of, truth be told. You know, you can't really afford, like, you know, Mac Air if you are really from one of the poor neighborhoods in Cairo. So you might go to an internet cafe and be an activist, but I do think the Facebook revolution had a veneer of the secular elite. Cairo is proud of American University, but American University may, along with Zamalek, be the living embodiment of that elite. So that elite clings to this notion, but I think it's been dissipated over time, sadly. And I think it's going to be hard for Egypt to direct its ship the right way toward an inclusive democracy that can also be inclusive of those Islamists who want to see Sharia be a part of the democracy. That is an equation that, you know, law schools in America and this school, we could play a role in helping them figure that out. Because I don't think they're mutually exclusive any more than the founding fathers of this country, who were very religious, didn't say we don't want God anywhere near our lives. They just said we want to have a separation of church and state, not God out of government. That's a very different concept. It's a complex and beautiful document, our Constitution. Sharing that, teaching that, is something that I would really welcome. I think initiatives where law schools could go and really work to help the Constitution be formed, initiatives where we as journalists could do much more to help them with freedom of expression and freedom of the press. We do a big series of fellowships in Egypt, and I'm really proud of it. We really are trying to train these great young Egyptian journalists to hold true to what we would see as empowered in the First Amendment, but which they don't have written in their Constitution. And there are very little protections, and now they're vulnerable. Now they're really truth to power, excuse my language, kick-ass journalists who I fear could get arrested, and some are, now that the military's back. Suddenly that hopeful thing about freedom, truth, all that, really, really in question right now. So I wish there was more of that secular core. Maybe that's the future, is to embolden it, to pull it forward, to strengthen the country's future. But we'd have to face the history that it was weakened under Mubarak.
Charlie, thank you so much for coming to the Clinton School and coming to Little Rock. You're welcome anytime. You can watch the entire film, Egypt in Crisis, online at pbs.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me. Thanks for coming out.
Okay.